00151. Post-launch. While the phone launch party didn't have as many live viewers as Theo thought it would, the video uploaded afterwards exploded, and within days the phones were the only thing people talked about. The free advertising they gained by giving out phones to major celebrities and popular Vibe users was the main reason. The mainstream media also helped to promote the phone's popularity, since it was heavily featured on a lot of news channels. Tony was also invited to be on a few popular talk shows to promote and talk about the phone. Since that was the case, Theo gave Tony the idea to give everyone in the audience a free phone. That just hyped up the expected release more and increased the pre-orders. Another bonus was with the access to a high-end camera in their pocket. A lot of the Vibe users with the phones started to use the photo platform on the site. Out of all the platforms Theo created, it was still the slowest growing. But with cell phones being released, he expected that to change soon. As for the official release date, people started showing up to the new Stark mobile stores days before release to save a spot in line. It was one of the first times something like this happened for a product launch, so it just added even more hype to the release date. As for the release itself, it mostly went off without any problems. Actually, the only real problem was inventory, since most stores sold out of phones on the first day or two. While Theo expected the phone to be popular, he didn't realize just how popular it could be. Within a week, they sold out of all the phones they had created, and Tony's factory was scrambling to make more. Since they wanted to keep everything a secret until after the phone was launched, Tony only set up a single manufacturing plant with strict NDAs for all employees. It was only a slight setback though, since a new plant was already built. It just needed workers and the materials to start up production. After about a month or so, Tony's company was able to fulfill all the back orders, and the rush to buy the phones died down. That said, they were able to sell over 40 million phones in little over a month, and Tony's company made over $10 billion in gross profit. Well, those numbers weren't made public yet, but would be released during the next quarterly earnings report. Theo already bought up a bunch of Stark Incorporated stock as he waited for the stock to practically double, since the company only made around $20 billion gross profit last year. Tony was also in high spirits since the phone release, but not because of how well it was doing. No, Tony was happy because he finally became the most followed person on Vibe. When Theo heard the reason, he shook his head and called Tony an idiot. With the launch event out of the way and a steady production of phones being created, Theo moved on to stage 2 of the phone project. His goal with this was to get his phones into the hands of every government official and company executive he could. It didn't matter how big or small they were, he wanted all of them to have one of Tony's cell phones. Theo knew making that happen would take a while, but he talked Tony into giving governments and companies a deal on the phones. He also created a special software package for the phones. It was focused on productivity and wasn't loaded with all the extra applications the normal phones used. While Theo waited patiently for his potential victims to take the bait, he focused on other tasks related to the phones. With the phones officially released, he needed to open up the App Store. While the phones came preloaded with software, he knew people would want to customize it. So he already created clones of the most popular software in his past life. While he didn't go crazy with microtransactions or gacha games, he still incorporated some of them for a reasonable price in the games he copied. He also removed almost all the features that made the games highly addictive. They were still fun to play and people enjoyed them, but they didn't need to play the game just for the dopamine rush they produced. As for other games that might be created with those game mechanics, Theo would just ban them outright if they tried to release them in the App Store. He also planned to stop anyone who tried to copy his Vibe platforms. Was it underhanded? Sure, but Theo didn't trust other people to keep the general public's best interests at heart. With the phone project out of the way, Theo arrived at Tony's house with a few more projects he wanted to make. Since they already had cell phones, he now wanted to create smart home devices and have Tony make them. With a couple pizza boxes in his hand, along with a flash drive, Theo portaled to Tony's in his Ezekiel persona. After Ezekiel stepped out of the portal, he found Tony's workshop empty but was greeted by Jarvis, who said, "Welcome, Ezekiel. Mr. Stark is currently upstairs talking with Mr. Stain." Ezekiel took out the flash drive he brought and plugged it into Tony's computer before he asked, "Thank you, Jarvis. Is anyone else here?" As Ezekiel moved towards the door for the stairs, Jarvis said, "Happy is currently out with Mississippi Potts, but they will be back within 10 minutes. Oh, maybe I should order more pizza." Ezekiel said as he opened the door. That won't be necessary. They are coming back with food now. Jarvis said. Oh, okay. As Ezekiel walked up the stairs, he heard, Tony, I don't want to complain about the current success you had with the phone.
But
Tony interrupted as Ezekiel walked into the living room and saw Tony seated on the couch while Obadiah stood next to it with his back to Ezekiel. Obadiah let out a sigh as he said, but we have military contracts we need to complete and we are a bit behind on them. Tony noticed Ezekiel as he said, can you believe this guy? I make the company billions of dollars and it's not enough. Ezekiel shrugged and moved towards the coffee table as he said, if you have contracts, you should probably fulfill them. Then again, it's none of my business, and I don't plan to make it my business either. Stain smiled at Ezekiel as he said, it's nice to see you again, Ezekiel. After Ezekiel placed the pizza boxes down, he reached out and shook Obadiah's hand as he said, same to you, Mr. Stain. Actually, I'm surprised I didn't see you at the launch party. I'm pretty sure you were on the invite list. Just call me Obadiah or Obi. Obadiah said as he released Ezekiel's hand. As for the party, I missed it because I was in Japan conducting some business and thought it was just a normal party Tony was putting on. Obadiah said. Ezekiel nodded in understanding as he sat down on the couch and Tony opened one of the pizza boxes before he said, I just sent Happy and Pepper out to get food, but I could never say no to pizza. Obadiah glanced at the pizza box and the hot pizza as he asked, is there a Joe's Pizza nearby? Tony shook his head as he finished his first bit and said, no, this is straight from NYC. Really? How is it so fresh? Obadiah asked as he studied the still steaming pizza. Tony pointed at Ezekiel as he said, he can portal anywhere he wants. As Ezekiel moved the top box aside and opened the other box, he said, I'm mostly restricted to Earth for now. Obadiah glanced between Tony and Ezekiel for a moment as he started to laugh before he said, portal anywhere on Earth? That's not possible. Tony shrugged as he said, I said the same thing, but he does it all the time. Ezekiel nodded as he lifted his hand and spun it in a circle before he said, look behind you. Obadiah glanced behind himself and froze in place as he looked at a portal. As he studied it, he noticed the Eiffel Tower in the distance and asked, is that the Eiffel Tower? Yup. Ezekiel said before he took a bite of his pizza. Obadiah turned towards the portal and went to touch the edge as Tony said, if you touch the edge, it will paralyze your arm for the next half an hour. Tony elbowed Ezekiel as he said, I found that out the hard way because some jerk didn't warn me. Obadiah stopped in place before he dropped his hand and asked, is this real? Could I really go to France through this? Yeah, or anywhere else he makes one. Tony said. Ezekiel closed the portal as Obadiah turned around and asked, how did you make it? Magic. Tony and Ezekiel said at the same time. Ezekiel glanced at Tony, who smirked before he took another bite of his pizza, and Obadiah asked, magic? Yup, but Tony doesn't believe me. Tony nodded in agreement as he said, because magic isn't real. It's either one of your weird powers or some kind of alien tech you don't want to share with me. Ezekiel shrugged as the front door opened and Happy said, Tony, we're back with the food. As Happy and Pepper moved into the living room area and noticed Ezekiel, who smiled at them before he pointed at the pizza boxes and said, I brought pizza. Happy smiled as he held up the bags as he said, I brought burgers. As everyone but Obadiah settled down on the couches to eat, Ezekiel asked, so Happy, how are things going with Anna? You're really gonna move on from the portal thing without explaining anything? And what about the alien technology you mentioned? Obadiah asked. That sounds about right. Tony said as Happy and Pepper nodded in agreement. I explained it. It's not my fault if you don't believe me. As for the alien technology, it's alien tech. What else do I need to explain? Ezekiel said as he pulled out some French fries and stuffed them in his mouth. Obadiah wanted to say something when Tony pointed at the couch and said, just sit down and eat. I've learned it's a waste of time to think about things when it comes to Ezekiel. Obadiah reluctantly sat down on the couch as Happy said, things are going great with Anna, by the way. Ezekiel smiled as he asked, you should invite her to join you when you go on vacation. Happy nodded as he said, I've been thinking about it. Maybe when it gets closer and she isn't busy with a movie. Just let me know and I'll make sure she's bumped ahead so she can join you. Ezekiel said with a wink, that would be great. Happy said with a smile, As Ezekiel took another bite of pizza, Tony asked, "So what brought you by? I thought you were gonna be busy after the phone launch." "I wanted to start on the next project since the cell phone was so popular," Ezekiel said after he finished his bite. Obadiah and the others seemed interested as Ezekiel said, "Jarvis, can you show us those project files I brought?" "Right away, sir." The lights dimmed slightly, and a holographic projection appeared over the coffee table to show a bunch of different possible projects Ezekiel wanted Tony to work on. While Ezekiel wanted Tony to work on smart home tech, he knew it would be easier to give him a bunch of options to choose from. So as everyone ate, Tony browsed through the projects before he found a few things he was interested in and wanted to work on. 00152. An unexpected guest? Theo was seated in the lotus position as he focused on the spell he was working on. It used his personalized spell matrix for the foundation, and he was in the process of adding to it. Once he was satisfied, he would need to set it in place before he asked Tao and Agatha to test it. It was the spell that acted as his main mental barrier and kept people out of his mind. After he learned the basics from Tao and Agatha, Theo spent at least an hour a day adding to the barrier, with the help of a dedicated clone. The clone was created every day to help improve the spell matrix in theory. Once it is dispelled, Theo took that knowledge and used it to add to a new spell matrix. He basically took the 24 hours of theory crafting his clone produced and added it into his spell matrix within an hour's time. He tried it a few times with more clones, but the results were about the same, so Theo only used one clone for the job now. While his spell matrix was currently nowhere close to Tao or Agatha's in strength, it was strong enough to keep most advanced masters of the mystic arts out of Theo's head. Theo finished the final touches to the spell before he slowly brought it back inside himself and let it settle into place. Afterwards, he glanced at Tao as he said, "You can begin whenever you're ready." Tao raised up her teacup as she said, "All right, brace yourself." Theo only waited for a moment before he felt Tao probe his mental defenses. It was almost gentle at first, but quickly ramped up in power. Before long, it felt like someone slammed a hammer into his mental barrier and Theo grimaced in pain. It happened a few more times before blood started to run out of Theo's nose. Tao's attack finally finished as she broke past his barrier and said, "Not bad. You lasted almost 5 minutes." Theo was completely pale and his face was contorted in pain as Agatha said, "You shouldn't break his spell matrix every time you test it." Tao waved off the concern as she said, "How will he learn properly if he doesn't rebuild it every time? You could at least tone down your power a little. Look at him. He is still recovering," Agatha said as she observed Theo. Tao shook her head as she said, "Why should I show him mercy when an enemy won't? The more he gets used to having his barrier broken through, the better he'll be able to cope with it. It's fine. I would rather it be this way in the first place," Theo said as he started to create a new spell matrix. As the new matrix formed, he said, "While I might not enjoy it, the backlash is becoming a little less each time." Tao nodded in agreement as she said, "That's only natural. Once you stop being stunned by it, I will switch to single hits to break your barrier." Theo started to sweat a little as he continued his training for the night. After he was finished with his training and checked over a few things, he made a new batch of clones before he headed to bed after a quick shower. In the morning after he woke up and got ready for the day, he headed upstairs and was greeted by his father in the kitchen who said, "Just in time. Help me prepare breakfast." "What are we going to make?" Jacob smirked as he said, "I thought pancakes sounded good. What do you think?" Theo nodded in agreement as he said, "Of course." Jacob smiled slightly as he started to pull out ingredients and set them on the counter as he said, "All right, get me the large mixing bowl and pull out the big cast iron skillet." As Theo helped his father prepare breakfast, Jacob asked, "Are you ready for today?" "Yeah, but not as much as Millie and Isaac," Theo said with a smile. Jacob shook his head as he said, "Those two. I still don't understand why they love sweets so much." Theo shrugged as he set out plates on the table and said, "It's a little strange, since you and Mom aren't that big on sweets either. It doesn't help that you make some type of dessert every few days," Daniel said as she walked into the kitchen. Jacob winked at his wife as he said, "You bake stuff for the kids just as much as me, sometimes even more." "Speaking of my siblings, where are they?" Theo asked. Millie said she wanted to be a good big sister and is helping Isaac get dressed, Daniel said with a hint of a smile. Theo shook his head as he said, "It must be because she is getting cake today." Yup. Both of his parents said at the same time before everyone laughed. Breakfast went smoothly and afterwards they walked over to Peter's house to get him along with his family. From there, they took the subway downtown and went to a museum before they spent a few hours there as they explored the place. It was a science museum and had a lot of activities for kids to do. Once they finished, they had some pizza before they took the subway back to Brooklyn. Instead of heading back home, then detoured and went to the park instead. Once there, it became obvious why they went there. Set up inside the park near the picnic area were Ben, May, Jonathan, Sarah, and a bunch of other people, while a banner was hung up that said, "Happy Birthday, Peter." Richard picked up his son as he said, "Happy birthday," as everyone else joined in. Peter blushed slightly while everyone congratulated him and wished him a happy birthday. As Richard and Mary hugged Peter before he was put back down and Richard said, "Go greet your friends and have fun," Peter nodded as he glanced at Millie and Theo before he said, "Come on." Theo followed Peter to the other kids as their parents took their younger siblings with them to mingle with the adults. Once there, they were greeted by mostly classmates and a couple kids from the neighborhood. As the kids gathered around Peter to congratulate him and wish him a happy birthday, Theo noticed a few people approaching the party. It took Theo only a moment to realize who they were, and he frowned slightly to himself as he thought, "What the hell is he doing here?" It was a man and woman along with a young boy. The woman and kid were fine, but the man who was with them Theo didn't trust. It was someone Theo looked into once before, but didn't do anything about because he had no connection with Peter's parents. But it looked like things changed for some reason, and Theo wasn't happy about it. Theo wanted to understand what was going on, so he moved towards Richard and Mary, since that was where the man was headed. While Theo could eavesdrop on them from where he was, he wanted to be closer to them just in case something strange happened. As the group approached closer, Richard smiled at the man as he said, "Mr. Osborne, thanks for coming. Please, just call me Norman. We're business partners after all," Norman said with a smile. Richard reached out and shook the man's hand as he said, "Sorry, it's a force of habit." "It's fine, Richard," the man said before he gestured to the pale-skinned woman beside him and the little boy as he said, "This is my wife, Emily, and my son, Harry." After they greeted each other, Richard glanced over towards Peter, but noticed Theo, who was close by, and said, "Theo, come over here for a moment. I want you to meet someone." Theo didn't want to join them and instead watched them from a close distance, but came over as he said, "Yes, Uncle Richard?" Richard smiled as he pointed to Harry and said, "Theo, this is Harry. Take him over and introduce him to Peter and the others." Theo nodded as he stretched out his hand and said, "Hi, I'm Theo, it's nice to meet you." Harry shook hands with Theo as he said, "It's nice to meet you too." After they shook hands, Theo led Harry towards the group of kids and started to introduce him around to everyone as he focused his hearing on Osborne. It was a little bit of a pain to split his attention, but wasn't an issue since the kids didn't seem to notice he was slightly distracted. As for what Osborne and Richard talked about, it all seemed to be normal. As the party went on, Theo always kept part of his focus on Osborne, but overall the party was fine and nothing happened. Theo didn't think anything would, but he still didn't let his guard down. After the party finished and Theo was back at home, his main priority was figuring out how and why Osborne was working with his uncle. When he arrived in his training area, he immediately made clones and then created a portal for them. After most of them left for the base, he created another portal for Shursui, Kakashi, and Itachi. After they left and the portal closed, Tao asked, "Where did you send those three?" "I ran into a potential enemy today. I sent them to scout and get me access to their computer systems," Theo said as he moved towards the rock wall to practice. "How much of a threat are they?" Agatha asked before she took a sip from her teacup. Theo frowned slightly as he said, "He is almost always evil and could turn into a powerful enemy if we do nothing. He wouldn't be an issue for either of you, but you never know what could happen in this crazy world. I would rather kill him now than deal with him later in that case." "You really think he could become a major threat?" Tao asked. Before Theo moved out onto his training wall, he said, "I'll show you what he might become, and you tell me." Theo glanced over his shoulder before his red eyes captivated Tao and Agatha, who relaxed into their chairs. He sent them all the information he knew on Norman Osborne and the type of monster he could become in the form of a memory genjutsu. About an hour passed before Tao and Agatha came out of the Jinjutsu. Tao picked up her teapot to refill her cup and frowned as she noticed it was cold. She glanced up to Theo, who was currently near the top of the rock wall, and said, "Come down here and make me some fresh tea like a good disciple." Theo glanced over his shoulder down at Tao, a few hundred feet below, as he said, "In a few minutes." After Theo completed his climb, he let go of the wall and fell into the water pit below him. Once he climbed out, he moved to Tao before he took the teapot to the kitchen area and dumped the old tea into the sink. He then used a spell to fill it with water and took it back to its holder. Once he placed it down, he used another spell to heat the water to the perfect temperature. Afterwards, he pulled out a tea ball and filled it before he placed it inside another teapot and slowly poured the hot water over it. After he emptied the first pot into the other pot, he let the tea steep as he asked, "So what do you think?" "You're right. He could become troublesome." Theo nodded as he took a seat between Tao and Agatha before he pulled out his tablet and checked it to see if he had access to Osborne's computers yet. As he worked, Agatha said, "Worst case, we'll just kill him." Theo glanced up at Agatha, who smiled as she said, "Being proactive with people like that is always the best choice." Tao nodded in agreement as she said, "Just let us know what you plan to do. We'll help you if it's needed." Theo smirked slightly as he said, "Thanks, but I am pretty sure I can take care of the current version of him alone if it comes to that." 00153. A simple choice. It only took about a week before Theo collected all the information he needed. It turned out that Richard and Mary figured out a new type of formula. Theo didn't dig into it too much, but it apparently helped increase the potential of drugs it was incorporated into. After they tested it for a while and realized its potential, they decided to pitch it to a few companies and partner with the one who offered them the best deal. While Theo was happy for them, he was upset Oscorp won, and they now had a partnership with Norman. If Theo paid more attention to his extended family's business matters, he would have used Vibe and offered them a deal himself. Theo couldn't help it as he scolded himself for being lax. Once Richard and Mary quit their old jobs and set up a lab in the shop's basement, he was pretty sure they wouldn't have any trouble at all, so he stopped looking into their lives. It turned out he was wrong and would now spare a couple clones to monitor them, along with everyone else in his extended family. That wasn't all he did, though. He also asked Tao and Agatha to make a life-saving spell for each of his family and extended family members. It was basically a spell shield that would save them in an emergency or teleport them away if needed. It could also be used to track them in case they were kidnapped. It was a spell that was targeted at their soul, so it was hidden extremely well, and Theo didn't have to worry about it being removed since it wasn't tied to an object. Was it overkill? Could it cause issues for him in the future if it goes off accidentally? Sure, but he would rather have his family safe instead of dead. With his family now safe from threats, Theo turned his attention to Osborne. He used his clones and searched through everything even remotely related to Norman Osborne. What he found wasn't as bad as he expected it to be, though. Sure, he had a few backroom deals and his taxes were a little skewed, but overall he seemed better than the average CEO of most companies. Since that was the case, Theo decided to test the man. He would make him an offer, and whether or not he accepted it would decide his fate. It was almost midnight and Norman was seated at his desk inside his home office as he worked on a project. As he typed away on his computer, someone said, "You should rest. It's not good to stay up so late." "I'll be fine, Bernard," Norman said before he paused his typing and looked up at the person before him. "Sorry for the intrusion, but we need to have a little chat, and this seemed like the best place to have it," the man said. Norman studied the man before him for a few moments. He wore an all-black cloak with a hood that covered his face in shadows. But as Norman looked at the hooded area, he realized the hood was filled with wisps of smoke. After a few moments, Norman moved his foot a little to hit a button hidden under his desk as he said, "You should call my secretary and schedule a meeting then." The smoke wafted out from the hood as he said, "I'd prefer if we kept this meeting private and off record. It's also why no one will answer that button you just pushed." Norman frowned slightly as he sat back in his chair and said, "It seems you have me at a disadvantage, mister. My name doesn't matter. I only came here to give you a choice that will decide your future." "And what exactly is this choice?" Norman asked with narrowed eyes. "The life of your family or the legacy of the company you want to build?" Norman slammed the palms of his hands down on his desk as he said in a raised tone, Are you trying to threaten me and my family?" The hooded man shook his head as he said, "It's not a threat, it's a choice. Your wife suffers from Osborne syndrome, and that will kill her in the next few years." Norman narrowed his eyes as he said, "No one should know about that. And yet here I am. I also know your son Harry has inherited Osborne syndrome, but it is currently dormant alongside retroviral hypodysplasia, which he inherited from you. Your family really won the jackpot when it comes to rare genetic diseases, didn't they?" The man said in a mocking tone of voice. Norman gritted his teeth as he asked, "Did you just come here to mock my family, or is there a point to this?" The man looked directly at Norman, and for a moment Norman thought he saw a gleam of red where the person's eyes should be. The man then turned to look out the window as he said, "I'll give you a month to make your choice. If you start selling off your company and choose to live a quiet life with your family, then I will cure all of you, so you can live a long and happy life together." "And if I don't?" Norman asked as he narrowed his eyes at the man. "Then you can watch the person you love the most in this world wither away to nothing and spend the rest of your life knowing you could have saved them." The man held up both hands, and a moment later the right one showed Norman, his wife, Harry, and a couple more kids. They were in the living room playing a board game together, and everyone looked happy. In the man's left hand was the Oscorp building he was planning to build in downtown New York City. It looked beautiful to him, but the image changed slightly to show Norman himself. He was aged, while his face was a stern mask, and sorrow could be seen in his eyes as he looked out the window of the top floor of the building. The man held up the first one, where it now showed Norman with a smile on his face as he chatted with his wife, and he asked, "Will you choose love?" The man raised up the other one that now showed Harry, who looked scared as he tried to talk with his father before he asked, "Or will you choose pride?" As the images vanished, the man said, "You have 1 month." A moment later, the man disappeared into a cloud of smoke as Norman asked, "Why do I have to choose?" Norman frowned for a moment before he quickly walked out of his office to check on his family. Outside his office, he found his faithful butler Bernard passed out in the hallway beside a spilled serving tray that once carried a full teapot and some snacks. As Norman kneeled next to the man and tried to wake him up, he thought, "When did this happen? I didn't hear anything." After a few moments, Bernard woke up as he asked, "What happened, sir? Why am I on the floor?" Norman decided not to talk about the man who broke into the house as he said, "I'm not sure. I just came out of my office and found you like this." Bernard frowned as he looked at the mess that he made before he said, "I'm sorry about the mess, sir. I'll clean it up right away." Norman placed a hand on the other man's shoulder as he said, "It's fine, Bernard. I'll have one of the maids clean it up. You should go get some rest." "I'm fine, sir, I'll—" "That was an order," Norman said. "Yes, sir." Norman smiled at the man as he helped him up before he said, "I'm going to check on Harry and then head to bed myself. Have a good night, Bernard." Bernard bowed slightly as he said, "Same to you, sir." Norman left the man as he moved quickly to Harry's bedroom. On the way, he pulled out his phone and typed a message on it about the mess in the hallway so that one of the maids could clean it up. Once he arrived at his son's room, he put away his phone and slowly opened the door as he quietly went inside. He found his son fast asleep with part of his blankets thrown off to the side. Norman gently pulled the blankets back over his son and tucked him back into bed. As he watched his son sleep, the image of his son being scared of him flashed through his mind, and he frowned. He thought back to what the man showed him and shook his head as he thought, "That would never happen. Harry would never be afraid of me." Norman quietly left the room a few minutes later and headed to his bedroom. Inside, he found his wife hooked up to a couple machines as she rested in bed. She was in the starting stages of the disease and had no real outward signs anything was wrong besides slightly pale skin. But when she was at home, they hooked her up to machines to help monitor her condition and hopefully prolong the onset of the disease as long as possible. Norman moved next to his wife, and once he was close, she said, "You worked late again." Norman looked down at his wife, who smiled back up at him as he said, "Sorry, I lost track of time. It's not good for your health. Now hurry up and get ready for bed, young man," she said in a slightly stern yet joking tone of voice. Norman shook his head before he sat down in the chair next to the bed, took her hand in his and said, "Sure, in a few minutes. Just let me hold your hand for a while." As Norman gently caressed her hand, she asked, "What's wrong?" "Nothing. Emily turned to look at her husband, who was lost in thought, and studied him for a while before she asked, "What are you thinking about? Is it the building again?" Norman glanced at his wife for a moment before he remembered her surrounded by a few more children, which made him pause. Emily tugged on his hand as she asked, "Honey, what's the matter?" Norman smiled as he said, "Nothing. I was just lost in thought." Emily knew her husband better than anyone else and knew something was bothering him, but decided not to push the issue as she said, "Go change and come to bed. It's a little cold and I want to snuggle." Norman kissed his wife on the cheek before he said, "Okay." 00154. Hella learns about. Almost a week passed before Theo saw movement from Norman. It wasn't exactly what he expected to happen, but it was within his predictions. Norman reached out to Revival for help. It seemed he wanted to save his family and keep his business. Since Norman didn't want to follow the rules, Theo decided to pay him another visit and let him know that wasn't an option he had open. It was late at night again as Theo appeared inside the Osborne mansion. He quickly moved through the house and put everyone into a minor genjutsu that made them fall asleep before he moved to Norman's office. As he opened the door, he heard, "I won't need anything else tonight, Bernard. I'm going to sleep soon." When Norman didn't get a response, he glanced up and froze for a moment. A man cloaked in shadows stood in the doorway. As the man slowly entered the room, he said, "I see you tried to choose a third option, Mr. Osborne. Let's call that one greed. It's a pity you were only given two choices, though, and greed wasn't one of them." Norman narrowed his eyes as he said, "How do you know about that?" "Revival has cured over 20,000 people with terminal cancer. My family's issues should be easy for them to fix." The man nodded in response as he pulled a tablet out from within his cloak and typed on it. After a few moments, he stored it away as he said, "You should check your email." "I think Revival responded." Norman felt a sense of foreboding as he glanced at his computer screen for a moment and noticed the icon for a new message. He quickly opened it, and after he read it, his face fell. It was a reply message from Revival that said, "You only have two choices, love or pride." Norman slammed both his fists onto the desk as he asked, "Why are you doing this? Why do I have to choose? Isn't it obvious?" The man asked in a mocking tone. Norman glared up at the man as he said, "If it was, why would I even ask you?" The man shrugged as he said, "I guess you're not as smart as I thought you were." Norman continued to glare at the man until he pointed at Norman as he said, "It's just a simple test to see the type of man you truly are." "Why are you doing this to me?" Norman asked with a hint of anger in his voice. As the man started to disappear into smoke, he said, "You'll find out after you choose." After the man disappeared, Norman sank back into his chair as he let out a frustrated sigh and thought, "Why am I not allowed to have my family and my business?" After Theo left the Osborne home, he went to pick up some food and then head to Genosha. It was time for his weekly movie date with Hella. His portal opened up inside the mystic school hidden there, and he quickly made his way down into the depths of the place. He had to pass through a number of hidden and magically protected doors, hallways, and stairs before he reached his destination. Once there, he opened the door and said, "I brought you some food, master." Tao glanced up from her book as she said, "Going on a date with another woman, and you decided to bring me food? Well, aren't you a playboy?" Theo, in his Ezekiel form, smirked as he said, "What was that? You don't want any of this fried pork belly from your favorite place in Thailand?" Tao placed her book down and stood up as she said, "Oh, I just remembered I have something important to do. I won't be able to portal you to your date." Ezekiel instantly gave up as he pulled a bag out of his storage seal and placed it on the table as he said, "Here you go, master." Tao opened a portal to hell before she patted Ezekiel on the head as she said, "You're such a good student. Now go enjoy your play date." Ezekiel huffed slightly before he moved through the portal. On the other side, he found Hella, who smiled slightly as she asked, "Has it been a week already?" "Almost. I have stuff coming up and won't be able to stop by for the next few days, so I figured I would just come earlier than normal," Ezekiel said as he sat down in the chair he normally used. As he started to pull out food and drinks from his storage seal, Hella asked, "What do you want to watch today? How about some stuff from the Gundam franchise? We can start with the Gundam F91 movie, and if you like it, watch more from there." "Gundam? What's that?" Hella asked. Ezekiel finished placing all the food down as he said, "Let's watch it so you can find out." As they started to eat, the movie also began, and after a minute Hella asked, "I thought this was a movie? Isn't this just a kid's cartoon like Aladdin?" Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "While it is animated, this isn't a cartoon. This is from a country called Japan, and it's called anime." Ezekiel took on a serious tone as he looked at Hella and said, "Please never compare anime with cartoons. While some of it is made for kids, a majority of it is meant for teens and adults." Hella paused for a moment as she took in the serious look Ezekiel gave her before she said, "I'll watch this first and then decide if I agree with you." After they finished eating, and as they watched the rest of the movie, Ezekiel would glance at Hella sometimes to gauge her reaction. Her face remained mostly stoic, but there were hints of emotion sometimes, which made it seem like she enjoyed the movie. When it was finished, Ezekiel turned to Hella as he asked, "So what do you think?" "It was good. Actually, does Midgard have Gundams? They look like formidable weapons." Hella asked with interest. Ezekiel shook his head in pity as he said, "Unfortunately, the technology of Midgard isn't advanced enough to make something like that." Hella nodded in understanding before she said, "You don't need to use only technology to create one. A mix of technology and magic would work best." Ezekiel smiled as he said, "I've already thought about that, but my skills in runes are amateur at best. Maybe in another 10 years or so, after I have more practice." Hella glanced at the paused TV screen as she asked, "You said this is a franchise? What else should we watch?" "Yeah, it's pretty popular and has a lot of different shows and movies. How about we watch the 08THMS team?" Ezekiel said, "Okay." As the first episode started, Ezekiel pulled out a tray of cookies and asked, "You want some cookies?" One of them floated up in the air and moved towards Hella as she said, "Thank you." After Hella took a bite, her eyes widened in surprise before she said, "These are a lot better than the last cookies you brought." Ezekiel smiled as he picked up a cookie himself and said, "These are homemade by my parents and little sister. She wants to learn how to cook, so my parents have been teaching her. I still don't think it's the best idea though. I'm positive that once she learns how to bake a cake, our house will be filled to the brim with them," Ezekiel said with a slight chuckle before he took a bite of his cookie. Hella glanced at Ezekiel as she said, "I thought you didn't like sweets?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "I don't. But my sister made these specifically for me, so I have to be a good brother and eat a few of them." They chatted a little more as they watched the complete series, and after the last episode, Hella said, "Why did they make that last episode? It would have been perfectly fine to end it on episode 11. Ezekiel smirked slightly as he said, "You're not the first person to think that, and you definitely won't be the last." As Ezekiel thought about packing up and heading back, Hella turned towards him as she asked, "Do you have time for one more?" Ezekiel pulled out his phone and checked the time before he said, "Sure, another movie wouldn't hurt. How about we watch Char's Counterattack?" As the new movie started to play, Hella asked, "Is there any other anime you would recommend I watch?" Throughout the movie, Ezekiel recommended a few movies and shows to watch along with some manga Hella could read. Once the movie ended, Ezekiel cleaned up and said goodbye before he disappeared through a portal. After Ezekiel left, Hella stared at the spot where the portal closed with a hint of sadness in her eyes before she let out a sigh and said, "Play Gundam Wing the series." Once he arrived back on Earth, his phone started to go crazy with a bunch of text messages and missed calls. As he pulled out his phone to see what was going on, his phone started to ring. It was Tony, and as soon as he answered it, he heard, "Finally! Why were you ignoring me?" "I was off planet. Why? What's up?" Ezekiel said, "I wanted." "Wait, did you say off planet? As in you weren't on Earth?" Tony asked in an excited tone, "Are you an idiot? What else do you think off planet means?" Ezekiel said as he rubbed the bridge of his nose, "Hey, don't call me an idiot. I just didn't know you could leave Earth so easily. Where do you think I got most of that alien tech from?" Ezekiel asked. "Fuck. You've been going to other planets, sleeping with hot alien babes, stealing their technology, and didn't invite me? I thought we were friends." Ezekiel let out an annoyed sigh before he said, "How in the world did you even come to that type of conclusion?" "You know what, on second thought, I don't want to know. Will you take me with you the next time you go off planet?" Tony asked in an excited tone, "So you can go out and get a space STD?" "Yes." "Wait, I don't want that. I just want to meet some hot alien women," Tony said. Sure you do. Whatever. I'll think about it after you grow up. Now why did you contact me 1,000 times like some kind of clingy and suspicious girlfriend? I did not. It was only like 100 text messages, Tony said before he added, oh yeah, I almost forgot. I finished some of the prototypes you asked for and wanted you to come check them out. Really? Yeah, come over and bring some food while you're at it, Tony said before he hung up the phone. Tao, who heard most of the conversation, said, isn't it a little late? Normally you head to bed about this time. Ezekiel glanced at the time before he said, worst case, I'll just let my clone go to school for the day. Ezekiel put his phone away as he added, I'll see you later and have a good day, Master. 00155. There was only ever one choice. When Ezekiel arrived at Tony's house, he expected only 2 or 3 prototypes. What he found instead was that Tony finished all of them. Apparently, Tony liked a lot of the concepts and wanted them for his own house, so he went out of his way to complete them all. All the prototypes Tony created were designed around creating a smart home. He made a smart thermostat, lights, doorbell, garage door opener, and many more. All of it was designed to work and integrate seamlessly with the cell phone they created. Ezekiel already finished the software that connected everything together easily. It would just need some fine-tuning now that they had the prototypes. He also planned to let people create their own software to interact with the devices if they wanted. It would help create more jobs, open up competition in the industry, and also help sell more of the products. Besides that, Tony completed another project Ezekiel asked him about. It was a state-of-the-art body camera. While he could have made a larger version and shrunk it down with help from Hank, he wanted to create something that could easily be mass-produced without much issue. It took a while for Tony to figure out how to do it, since he needed to shrink everything down and keep the specs Ezekiel asked for. But now that he had some working prototypes, he needed to test it out. Ezekiel planned to use it while he went around and fought crime. Once he was satisfied with it and how it functioned, he planned to mass-produce them and give them to police stations around the world, starting with the US first. While it would cost a lot to do something like that, Ezekiel didn't care. His end goal was to get as much information as possible. It would also help keep police officers more accountable and make it easier to prosecute people in court cases. He was sure there would be a big pushback from all over the place about the body cameras at first, but that was part of the reason he planned to give them away for free. Add in some help from Vibe and the media and it should all work out. At least that is what Ezekiel hoped for. While Ezekiel was at Tony's, he also inquired about the project to give cell phones to the government. He expected there to be some issues, but currently the only issue they had was making enough phones. It turns out that when Tony offered to sell discounted phones to the US government, they instantly agreed. The next few weeks passed by quickly for Theo. He mainly trained, worked on a few programming projects, visited Hella, Tony, and spent time with Gabby and the other kids. He also kept track of what Norman was doing and if he was looking to sell off his company. At first, there was no movement and Theo thought his plan failed. But during the last week of the deadline, an announcement was made that Norman wanted to sell his company. There were a lot of rumors and speculation going around about why he wanted to sell his business, but no answer was forthcoming to the general public. Theo himself didn't make an offer for the company, but he used a shell company to bid for the research project Richard and Mary worked on. He wanted control of it so he could keep them safe and didn't have to worry about something happening to them. Even with the magical protection spell placed on them, Theo was being cautious. Once the contracts for the sale of the company were in negotiation, Theo sent a message to Norman that read, "I'm glad you chose wisely. Once the sale is complete, I will contact you." While the normal process to sell a company could take up to a year, this one only took a month. Oscorp wasn't a mega corporation just yet, but it was still a decent-sized one. It also had a lot of famous scientists and important projects being worked on there. So when Osborne looked around for interested parties, he found a few pretty easily. Since that was the case, Theo worked quickly to place bids for the projects he wanted. He also asked for the people who worked on the projects. It took a little bit, and he overpaid for everything, but in the end, he picked up what he wanted. Theo was able to purchase Richard and Mary's project, along with their work contract for almost double the price. Beside that one, he also picked up 2 other important projects. The first one was for limb regeneration, which was headed by Dr. Kurt Connors. While it wasn't really needed with Project Revival, Theo thought it would be a good idea to pick it up. He planned to help Kurt out with a new body through revival, and then have the man slowly perfect the formula. He figured if the man wasn't rushing to cure his own issue, the lizard would never happen. At least that is what he hoped for. The other project he acquired was one that explored ways to create a new power source. It was run by Dr. Otto Octavius, and with Theo picking the man up this early, he hoped nothing would happen to the guy. He was a brilliant scientist, and Theo wanted to help the man achieve his goals. He also wanted to use the project to take over the power industry with clean and super cheap power. But he didn't plan to test the project on Earth in case something happened and it created a black hole or something. With those people and projects now under his control, Theo needed to find a place for them to work at. It looked like he would need to change the design for his Vibe project slightly and incorporate more space for scientific laboratories. VVVVV. It was almost midnight and Norman was seated in his home office as he watched his computer screen. Just a week ago, he was still a successful business owner, so the habit of staying up late in his home office was hard to break. The only problem was Norman had nothing to work on. Currently, his computer was on and a web browser was pulled up that showed Vibe's video platform. He just watched another random video out of complete boredom. After the video finished, someone said, "See, retired life isn't so bad." Norman glanced up as he asked, "You think this is fun?" The man covered in smoke and shadows shrugged as he said, "It's a good way to kill some free time. Plus, some of that is better than what you would find on TV." Norman tried to find the man's face hidden in the smoke-filled hood as he said, "I did what you asked." The man nodded before he said, "You were a little slow, but you made the right choice." Norman leaned back in his chair as he clasped his hands together and asked, "When will you keep your promise?" "Soon enough. First, I need to give you something," the man said as he lifted his arm above Norman's desk. He touched part of his arm, and a moment later, a small metal briefcase appeared on the desk. As the man pulled his hand back, he said, "I brought that so you wouldn't get bored." Norman glanced at the case as the man said, "Open it up. I'm sure you'll appreciate it." After a few moments, Norman reached over and clicked open the locks on the briefcase before he opened it up. Inside were a few USB drives, a large folder filled with papers, and a couple sealed vials. As Norman looked at everything, the man said, "Just because you sold your company doesn't mean you need to give up your original passion. This is research into a few different ideas I've had over the years. Most of it is close to complete, but all of it still needs work and fine-tuning." Norman picked up the large folder and opened it up to read a little bit about it before he asked, "And why exactly are you giving this to me?" "Because most of that is in your and your wife's field of expertise." Norman frowned as he asked, "Is this why you made me sell my business? You want me to complete these projects for you?" "No, I could complete them myself if I wanted. You can think of this as an apology gift for forcing you to sell your company." Norman glanced back down at the first research project as he said, "But something like this will be worth tens of billions once it's completed. I already have more money than I know what to do with. What's the point in having even more?" The man asked in a mocking tone of voice. Norman glanced up at the man as he asked, "Then what's the catch?" "You can complete the research, patent the technology and license them, or just sell it off. It doesn't really matter much to me, just don't start a new business." Norman couldn't see the man's face, but he felt like the man smiled as he said, "The catch is to make sure your first priority in life is always your family. Once your wife is healed, you should be able to have as many kids as you want. Her health was always the issue, and now it won't be." The man said, "When will she be healed?" Norman asked. "As soon as you wake up," the man said as Norman's vision blurred. Norman awoke to a scream which jolted him out of bed. He quickly glanced around the room before he noticed his wife frozen in place as she stared at a mirror. He walked towards her back as he asked, "What's wrong, sweetie?" He didn't get a response and instead froze in place once he was next to her. While they weren't that old to begin with, only in their mid-30s, they now both looked to be in their late teens at most. His wife's eyes widened in surprise as she noticed Norman's hair and face and asked, "Norman, did you do this?" Norman shook his head before he said, "No, someone else did." "Why?" Norman pulled his wife into a tight hug as he said, "He promised to do it if I did something in return." Emily hugged Norman a little tighter as she asked, "Is that why you sold the company off?" Norman reached down and lifted Emily's chin up and kissed her gently on the lips before he said, It was the only way to save your life. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes before she pulled Norman into a deep, passionate kiss. As they kissed each other, the outside world started to fade away, and the only thing that seemed to matter was that single moment for them. After some time passed, they heard someone clear their throat loudly, and they immediately stopped their makeout session. "Sorry to interrupt, but I came to inform you breakfast is ready," a handsome young man said. Norman studied the man for a moment before he asked, "Who are you?" "I'm Bernard, sir." Both Norman and his wife stared in shock at the man for a few moments before Norman asked, "Really?" The man nodded as he said, "I'm not sure how it happened, but it appears we've all regressed in age." Norman waved off the comment as he said, "Let's not worry about how it happened. Let's just be happy it did." Norman studied Bernard for a few moments before he added, "Also, now that you're young again, maybe you should think about starting a family yourself, Bernard." 00156, Soul Enchantment. It was only a few weeks later that the second stage of the cloning project finally encountered a way to proceed forward. While they figured out how to create clones for people that already had souls, they always had issues with creating a body with a blank soul already inside it. The main reason was that the people in Theo's head needed a soul they could take over. Otherwise, they would be closer to a shadow clone with a real body than anything else. That and their memories most likely wouldn't go back to Theo if the body was somehow destroyed. Since that was the case, Orochimaru, Tobirama, and the others spent the last few years trying to come up with a viable solution. They never figured it out themselves, but with some help from Tao and Agatha, they finally figured out a way that might work. It wouldn't be easy because Theo had a lot of people he would need to create bodies for, and they still weren't sure if it would even work correctly in the first place. The planned solution was a master-level enchantment to help create magical items with a will of their own. The Cloak of Levitation was an example of one such item. The main point of the enchantment was for the caster to cut off a tiny wisp of their soul and attach it to an item. Over time, that piece of soul would bond with the item and awaken. When Theo first heard about the spell, he asked, "What the hell? I need to turn into Voldemort?" Agatha glanced up from the book she was reading as she asked, "Who's that?" Theo pinched the bridge of his nose as he said, "Just some super evil douchebag in a kid's book who split his soul apart and liked to preach about pureblood supremacy." "That's in a book for kids?" Tao asked as she placed her teacup down. "Yeah, but it was from my past life. Actually, now that I think about it, I should probably write it myself since it doesn't seem to exist in this world." Agatha placed the book in her hands down as she asked, "Why? It's not like you need the money, and besides, you don't really want to be famous, right?" Theo smiled to himself as he said, "It's a good story. Besides, I already shared the first book with my sister, and she loved it. I might as well finish it for her." So this Voldemort person also cut off part of their soul to create a magical item? Tao asked with interest. Theo shook his head as he said, "No, they split their soul apart and placed it in different items as a way to escape death. But it was some kind of evil ritual where you had to kill another person for it to work. It also damaged the person's soul." "Oh, well, this enchantment is nothing like that. A master's soul would normally be a little weak after the process, but it will recover after a while. Sometimes days, sometimes weeks, just depends on how powerful their soul is," Tao said as she studied Theo while she talked. After a few more moments, she said, "If you use the spell, I am sure you will heal within hours at most." Why do you think that?" Theo asked curiously. "Your soul is stronger than 4 or 5 souls combined together. It's most likely because of your reincarnation, but we're not completely sure since you're the only reincarnated person we've met." Agatha said, "What? If that's true, how come you never told me about it before? I think that would be kind of important to know, right?" Theo asked as turned to look at Agatha. Tao smiled as she said, "Because you never asked. Besides, having a stronger soul is only useful for things like this. There are also some combat-based soul powers and some other esoteric spells that use the soul, but I would never recommend learning or using them, since you have a high chance of death when you do, unlike the enchantment spell which does not." Theo nodded along before he asked, "Oh, I guess that makes sense. Then why don't more people use this enchantment? Wouldn't it be beneficial to have a sentient magic item around?" Actually, the only reason more masters don't attempt it is because the chance you can make a relic that will accept you is extremely low, and most masters don't want to waste all of their crafting materials for nothing. I've personally failed over 10 times myself, Tao said with a bitter smile. Agatha nodded in agreement as she said, ebony was created in a somewhat similar manner, except there was no chance of rejection and the cost was higher. It took over 20 years for my soul to recover since I basically split it in half. Theo thought it over for a while before he asked, so if I use this enchantment and place a wisp of my soul in a clone body, it should slowly take over the body? Maybe? Honestly, this is all just theory. Besides, can you even transfer them into the clone body in the first place? Agatha asked. Inoichi and some of the other Yamanakas already figured that part out and tested it a few times. So we should have no issue after the piece of the soul is in place. Theo said. So all you need to do is master the enchantment, and then we can go test it out. Tao said with a glint in her eye as she floated a spell book over to Theo. Theo's back started to sweat as he realized what was about to happen next. The next few weeks flew by as Theo spent almost all of his free time while he mastered the special spell enchantment under Tao's graceful tutelage. The only part he didn't attempt was cutting off a wisp of his soul, since that would cause needless injuries to himself. Once Tao was satisfied with his mastery of the spell, she then allowed him to move on to the next step. Since no one was sure if it would actually work, Theo needed someone to act as the test subject for the experiment. Surprisingly enough, though, he had a ton of volunteers and ended up having to choose one himself. With everything else ready, he chose Orochimaru to create a clone body for himself. Once the body was finished a week later, that's when Theo attempted the enchantment spell with his soul. Theo was seated in the lotus position with the clone body next to him. He double-checked the spell components one more time before he closed his eyes and started to murmur the spell words to himself. Tao and Agatha were seated on either side of him and watched the entire process in case something went wrong with the spell. As Theo finished chanting the spell, he lifted his finger up and a tiny wisp of his soul came out. It was still connected to his soul, but when he touched it to a small rune mark on the clone body, it was cut clean from his soul and entered the mark. Next, Theo, Tao, and Agatha checked over the clone body and found that the soul transferred to the rune properly. As they studied it, Tao said, "Interesting. It seems like it's still part of your soul." "Really? But I thought the spell was supposed to completely sever it from me?" Theo asked. "It was, but I still see it as part of your soul," Tao said. Agatha nodded in agreement before she said, "Remove the rune. I want to see what happens." "Is that a good idea? Couldn't it dissipate if I remove it now?" Theo asked. A spell settled over them and the clone body, as Tao said, that will protect it, so go ahead and remove it. Theo reached out and touched the rune before he injected a tiny bit of chakra to burn the ink away. Once the rune was destroyed, the wisp of Theo's soul trapped there quickly went into Theo's body. Tao and Agatha both watched with rapt attention as it quickly reconnected with Theo's soul and disappeared into it, making it whole again. Once it finished, Tao said, "That was fascinating, but definitely shouldn't have happened." Theo studied his hand where the wisp of his soul reattached and asked, "All right, so I guess this isn't going to work?" "Not necessarily. You should try the spell again, but this time use it on a magic item," Agatha said. Tao nodded in agreement before she said, "I'm glad I came prepared." "You already have one completed?" Theo asked in surprise. Tao pulled out a slender-looking dagger made out of vibranium and some other materials as she said, "I was planning to enchant this myself, but I put it off." "Because you didn't want another item to reject you?" Theo asked with a smirk. Tao let out a sigh as she said, "Yes." Theo took the dagger from Tao as he said, "Maybe it will work this time because your precious student is the one doing it." "I doubt that will be the case. Besides, this is just a test to see if it was a fluke, or your soul really can't be separated," Tao said. Theo studied the dagger for a few moments and realized it was completely ready for the enchantment process. So he placed the dagger down and started to cast the spell. Once he finished the enchantment, Tao said, "Interesting. Indeed. Maybe the first time was just a fluke," Agatha said. Theo looked at the dagger himself and noticed the soul wisp was different from the last one. The first one he felt a slight connection to. This one he felt nothing from it, like it was never part of him. As he studied it, Tao said, "Try to enchant the body again." Theo handed the dagger to Tao as he said, "All right, give me a minute to remake the rune." Once everything was set back up, Theo started chanting the spell again. When he finished and attached the soul wisp, he could feel a connection to it. Theo sighed in disappointment before he said, "All right, so this doesn't seem to work. Is it because it's a body and not an inanimate object?" As Theo erased the rune to let the wisp of his soul reattach, Tao said, "That's the only logical thing I can think of. Let me try it and see what happens." Once the new rune was placed on the body, Tao quickly went through the enchantment process and the result was the same. For some reason, trying to place a piece of a soul into a body left a trace of the original soul. As Tao erased the rune, Theo said, "All right, looks like we need to go back to the drawing board again." "Not necessarily. We might be able to do a workaround, but we'll need to test it," Agatha said. Theo and Tao both turned to Agatha as she said, "Let's just enchant something and then transfer that piece of soul into the body. It's an extra step, but it should work." Tao nodded in agreement as she said, "That might work. Theo could enchant a piece of paper, and then we destroy it to get the soul wisp and place it inside the body." Theo touched the sealing scroll on his arm and pulled out a sheet of paper and pen as he asked, "You sure it will work on a piece of paper?" "Yes. The only reason you normally wouldn't enchant a piece of paper is because it could be easily destroyed. That's why all magic items that are enchanted this way are made with the best possible materials," Tao said as she took the paper and quickly started to draw the proper runes on it. Once she finished, she set it down in front of Theo as she said, "Mark the body and then let's try this again, with the paper as the target first." Theo quickly completed the spell and attached a wisp of his soul to the paper. After he finished, he couldn't feel any connection to the soul, so he smiled faintly before he asked, "All right, now what do we do?" Tao picked up the paper and ripped it in half a moment later before she used a spell to restrain the wisp of soul that flew out of it. Once she had it, she placed it over the rune on the body and it instantly disappeared into the rune. Theo and the others studied it for a while before Tao said, "Congratulations, it looks like it worked this time." 00157, a small display. After Orochimaru transferred into the clone body, Theo felt a little different. He still had Orochimaru's knowledge, but there was something missing from it. It was like the knowledge was no longer his, and that to understand it properly, he would have to go over it all and practice it himself. At least that is what it felt like to him. But that could wait for later, since Orochimaru was now in his new body. They first needed to run a bunch of tests to make sure everything was stable. Most of it was done by Tao and Agatha as they tested his body and soul for any issues. Once that was done, they tested the body for any problems and checked to make sure Orochimaru himself had no mental issues, besides the ones he already had. It took a few days, but once everything was completed, they moved on to monitoring Orochimaru's soul. It was easy to tell that within a week the soul wisp was growing steadily and had no issues. Since that was the case, Theo and Tao decided to use the time stone to make sure everything went correctly. It wasn't hard to do, and within a few hours they realized the whole soul creation process would work correctly. Afterwards, Theo decided to hold a town meeting in his mind with everyone else currently sharing it. While he wanted to give most people bodies, he knew some people didn't want that. He also had a list of people he wasn't sure if he should give bodies to in the first place. While he was sure some of them had issues because that was how they were written in the story. The people currently in his mind were copies of real people who existed at some point in a different world. So he made an effort to meet all of them at least once or twice. Since just having their memories was far different than having a conversation with that same person. Most of them were pretty normal, but a handful of people had issues. Theo appeared inside his mind palace near the village he created. Within moments, a handful of people appeared next to him. The first one who greeted him was Hagoromo, who asked, "So it's finally time?" Theo nodded as he said, "Yeah, everything went smoothly. Now I just need to see who wants a new body." As Theo spoke, a platform and seating area appeared and took shape. Once it was finished, people started to appear in the seats, and after a little over a minute, tens of thousands of people were there. It wasn't just ninjas though, but cooks, tailors, blacksmiths, carpenters, and a number of other professions. Basically, anyone who invented or improved something was in his mind. It was pretty funny to realize that some of the people only changed something a tiny bit and still ended up there. When Theo first asked to have all the knowledge from Naruto, he really didn't expect this. He also found out something interesting from the whole experience. Everyone in his head used to have chakra and could control it in one way or another, which proved his theory that chakra was the main reason this happened. From the original story, he always thought only the ninjas, samurai, and possibly some of the blacksmiths would have chakra. But it turned out that everyone had at least a tiny bit of chakra. It was just so small it wasn't worth it to train them in it, or they had no skill in it like Rock Lee. Theo looked out over the sea of assembled people and still couldn't believe how many people were inside his head. He smiled slightly before he moved out onto the platform to address everyone. While he could have just sent everyone a mental message, he wanted to do things a little differently. He glanced over everyone gathered before he said, "So I am sure everyone knows why I called you here today. It's taken a while, but I finally have a way to grant everyone a body. So the only real question now is, who doesn't want one?" As Theo looked out over the crowd, a good part of them raised their hands. After about a minute, half of the people there raised their hands, so Theo said, "All right, I understand and just want you to know. If you ever change your mind, let me know." With that, the people who didn't want bodies disappeared, and the rest of the people were shuffled to the front of the seating area before the platform. Theo glanced over them all and noticed almost all of them were combat-focused people. A handful of normal professions were still there, but only around 1% of them. "All right, since there are so many people that want bodies, we will have to do this in groups. Besides the body creation process, it will take time for my soul to heal. So the first few batches will be small while we figure out how long it will take for my soul to heal properly," Theo said. Madara, who was seated in the front, yelled out, "Who is going to be in the first batch?" Theo smiled slightly before he said, "I was thinking about the crafters, since there are less than 100 of them." Before Madara couldn't reply, Theo cut him off as he added, "I will also pick a handful of powerful fighters to join them." Madara nodded in agreement since he assumed he would be one of the people picked before Naruto said, "Yoshi, I can't wait to go eat ramen in Japan." Theo glanced at Naruto, who was seated next to his mom and dad, as he said, "You'll probably be one of the last people to get a body." "What?" Naruto said as his eyes grew large and went completely white while his mouth dropped open. "Sorry, Naruto, but I plan to give all the adults new bodies first. Depending on how long the healing process for my soul takes, I wouldn't expect you to have a body for at least a year, if not longer." "No fair. Why can't I get a body sooner?" Naruto asked. "The main reason is because it would be weird to give the youngest people bodies first. If I did that, some people would technically be older than their own parents," Theo said matter-of-factly. "Oh, I didn't think of that," Naruto said before Theo added, "Exactly. Besides, Tucci and Ayam are one of the first people to get a body. They will both need some time to recreate Ichiraka ramen in this world." Naruto's eyes widened, and he started to drool as he became lost in thought before his mom smacked him in the back of the head as she said, "Control yourself," then wiped her sleeve over her own mouth to wipe off a little bit of her own drool. Theo shook his head at their interaction before he glanced at the others as asked, "Anyone have any questions?" When no one spoke up, Theo said, "All right, I guess that's it for now. Carry on like normal, and wait for me to contact you when it's your turn to get a body." With that, Theo dismissed everyone but a handful of people, separated into two groups. The people he kept behind were the people he wasn't completely sure he wanted to help. While he tried not to judge them that harshly because of the story, they still had issues. Danzo was one of those people, and he was at the front of the larger group, along with the other elders from the Hidden Leaf Village. Danzo glanced at the people next to him and then stared at Theo before he asked, "I assume this means you don't want to give us a body?" Theo shook his head as he said, "No, I still plan to give you bodies." Danzo frowned slightly before he asked, "But? You would be the last people to get bodies, and they will be nerfed compared to everyone else." Theo held up his hand to stop everyone from responding before he said, "After a certain amount of time and proper trust, I would give you a new body that could match everyone else." Danzo rubbed his chin in thought before he said, "By that time, everyone else would be a lot more powerful and we would always be playing catch-up." Theo nodded as he said, "That would be an added bonus. But the main reason is you need to earn not just my trust, but everyone else's. Another elder named Koharp Udatane asked, "So you trust everyone else?" Theo shrugged as he said, "Up to a certain point. Besides, I have some fail-safes in place in case someone tries something stupid." Theo then glanced at the other group of people. They were a tiny subset of people who looked completely different from everyone else. They had pale, almost chalk-white skin and ash-gray hair. It was also the one group of people Theo wanted nothing to do with, so he had them locked up inside his mind until today. He looked them over again before he addressed the man at the front of the group and said, "As for you guys, I won't be giving you bodies at all." The person at the front of the group with slicked back hair started to laugh maniacally before he said, "You think you can stop us? If Lord Jashin wishes us to have new bodies, we will have new bodies." Theo smirked as he said, "I'm pretty sure Shikamaru was your god the last time I checked." The man at the front grinded his teeth slightly before he said, "The only god is Lord Jashin. If that's the case, you should probably check with him first to make sure he wants you to have new bodies," Theo said as the group of people started to slowly disappear. Haydn noticed what was happening first and said, "What? What are you doing?" Theo's smile turned predatory as he said, "Letting you meet your god." A few moments later, the group of people were completely gone, and after a moment someone asked, "What just happened?" Theo looked back at the other group and said, "I erased them from my mind and chakra." Theo then changed the area back to normal as he disappeared from his mind palace. Once Theo was gone, Danzo and the others with him turned to look at the spot Haydn and the other Jashinists just stood. After a few moments they started to disperse, but they all understood the unspoken threat Theo gave them. With the first batch of people picked, Theo had Orochimaru and some shadow clones prepare bodies for them. It would only take about a week because everyone would receive bodies that were around academy age. The reason being Theo wanted everyone to be as strong as possible and have a large amount of chakra. The first real batch was completed with only 150 people, but besides the normal crafters, Theo picked some of the strongest people he could. Most of them were former Kages, but a few of them were people who were known throughout the world to be strong at one point or another. On the day he planned to transfer the first batch, Theo made sure to skip school with a clone and spent a couple hours making soul wisps. Once everything was ready, he went to each body and gave them a soul wisp before he transferred the person over. The whole process took about half the day, but once it was finished he couldn't help but smile. He glanced at Tao as he said, "All right, it's done. You can wake them up." Tao waved her arm and a spell that kept the souls in place, and everyone asleep dropped, and a moment later people around the room started to wake up. Most of it was going smoothly until someone yelled out, "Hashirama, let's fight." The whole room turned to look at a naked boy with black hair who stood in a Captain Morgan-like pose with his arms crossed. Madara stood proudly as he looked directly at his rival and waited for a response before Theo shouted, "Put some fucking clothes on, you pervert." Another boy with white hair stood up naked and shouted proudly, "Who thinks they're a pervert?" He smiled pervertedly as he looked at everyone in the room as he said, "I'll show you what it means to be a true pervert." Theo facepalmed himself as he said, "The next batch we are putting into clothes first." 00158. Soul damage. With the first batch of people done, Theo decided to wait on making more. The main reason was he wanted to see how long it took for his soul to heal properly. While a single piece didn't take long, he created over 150 this time. So over the next week, Tao and Agatha checked his soul each day to make sure it healed correctly and how long it took. Just before the week passed, Theo's soul was completely healed. With that new information, Theo planned to make the next batch of bodies larger. He had Orochimaru create 1,000 bodies this time. They already had the facilities to complete the task, so it only took a week for all the bodies to be ready. Once everything was ready, Theo spent most of a day as he added a soul to each body. By the end of it, he was so tired and drained that he basically collapsed into his bed once he arrived home. Sleeping all night helped him recover a little, but he still felt off the next day like he didn't get enough rest. The whole day he was lethargic and had almost no energy. Once he came home from school, he created a clone and then headed down to his training center to get checked out. Theo was seated in the lotus position as Tao and Agatha examined him with magical spells. It took about half an hour, and once finished Tao said, "Your soul is healing. but it's a lot slower than the last time. Agatha nodded in agreement before she added, "My soul healed the same way after I created Ebony. I would suggest doing smaller batches from now on." Theo let out an exhausted sigh before he asked, "Is that why I also feel so worn out? Your soul is so robust. I'm actually surprised you're having difficulties at all. I could barely get out of bed when my soul was split in half, and you haven't even used a quarter of yours." Agatha said, "Helpful. This feeling doesn't last long. I'm not motivated to do anything right now," Theo said as he laid down on his prayer mat. He lazily glanced at his clones as he said, "At least my clones don't seem to be affected by it." A shadow fell over Theo as Tao said, "You might not be motivated, but that doesn't mean you can just skip practice." Theo gulped as he looked up at Tao, who smiled down at him. The next few hours turned into pure agony for Theo as Tao forced him to practice until he passed out. The next morning, Theo awoke in his bed and couldn't help but want to pretend to be sick, so he could spend the day sleeping in bed and not go to school. That is kinda what he did, since he created a clone and sent that to school for the day while he rested in bed and ate snacks. The rest of the week went pretty much the same way until the weekend. On the weekends, Theo tended to cut back on his training and would visit Hella, Tony, and anyone else he needed to. On Saturday night, Theo felt slightly better. He was still overly tired and had no real motivation to do anything. But as he got used to the feeling, it wasn't affecting him as much as before. Since it was Saturday night, he went out to get food, drinks, and some desserts for his movie night with Hella. Once he collected everything, he met up with Tao and Janosha so she could portal him over to Hell. As Ezekiel walked out of the portal, Hella turned to greet him before she froze. The hint of the smile on her face fell, and her eyes narrowed as she studied Theo for a few moments. Ezekiel missed her reaction as he went to pull the food out of his storage seal and said, "I was feeling lazy, so I brought pizza today." A moment later, the ground shook and Ezekiel stepped back in shock as he felt a palpable blood lust radiating from Hella. The chains that bound her in place strained and almost looked like they would snap as she asked in a soft tone that promised violence, "Who did it? What are you talking about? Who did what?" Ezekiel asked in confusion. "Who was the scum that hurt you? Tell me who dared to injure your soul?" Hella asked in a tone of cold fury. Ezekiel's eyes widened as he remembered Hella could see his soul, and before he could respond, Hella struggled against the chains again as she said, "Tell me who it was. I'll kill them." "It was me?" Ezekiel said as he awkwardly smiled at Hella. The bloodlust disappeared in an instant and Hella stopped struggling against the chains as she asked in surprise, "You injured yourself?" Ezekiel rubbed the back of his head as he said, "Yeah, pretty much." "Why would you intentionally injure your soul?" Hella asked with concern in her voice. "You remember the soulless people who came with me the first time I visited?" Ezekiel asked. Hella nodded, so Ezekiel said, "I am in the process of giving them proper bodies and souls. The only problem is I need to give them a tiny piece of my soul for it to work properly." Hella frowned as she asked, "Why would you do something so dangerous for someone else?" "It's a long story, but I'm kinda the reason they are soulless in the first place. So it's only right I help them out. Besides, it's not that dangerous. I just overdid it this time and created way too many." Ezekiel said, "Overdid it? You are missing almost a quarter of your soul. What happens if you can't heal properly?" Hella asked in concern. "We tested everything before I did this. My soul healed completely on the first tests, and I'm being monitored each day to make sure nothing goes wrong. I should be completely healed from this in 3 months with how everything is going." Hella's face went back to her normal, almost stoic appearance as she turned away from Ezekiel and said, "Fine, but don't do that again. It's not good to injure your soul." Ezekiel moved to his chair and sat down before he said, "I still need to give everyone else a soul, so I can't stop till I'm finished." Hella glanced at Ezekiel as she asked, "And how long will that take?" Ezekiel shrugged as he said, "A couple years at this rate." Ezekiel pulled out some drinks before he looked at Hella and said, "Thanks for being concerned about my well-being though. I appreciate it." The tiniest hint of red touched Hella's cheeks before she turned away from Ezekiel as she said, "You're welcome." Ezekiel spent longer than normal with Hella as they watched a bunch of classic action movies and chatted. With Ezekiel having no motivation to do much else right now, he figured it would be a better use of his time compared to lazing around his house and doing nothing. Plus, he had a clone active, so he wasn't worried about coming back anytime soon. He ended up spending all of Saturday night and most of Sunday with Hella before he finally left to go eat dinner with his family. Once he was home, he found his clone in his bedroom. It was busy on his computer as it worked on the program for his dad's shop. He had the clone dispel itself before he saved its progress and then headed upstairs to see if his dad needed help with dinner. To his surprise, he found Millie and Isaac being watched over by Daniel as they made something and Jacob prepared dinner. "What are you two doing?" Theo asked as he moved towards the kitchen table. Millie glanced up from the recipe book in front of her with a large smile on her face as she said, "We are making dessert." "Yeah, we are making chocolate chip cookies," Isaac said with a grin. Theo smiled back as he asked, "You want any help?" "No, we can do it ourselves," Millie said. "You can help me if you want," Jacob said as he finished chopping some vegetables. Theo headed towards the sink to wash his hands as he asked, "Okay, what do you need me to do?" The next half an hour passed quickly as everyone worked in the kitchen to prepare dinner. Just after they sat down to eat dinner, Daniel placed a large cookie sheet in the oven to bake. By the time they finished dinner, the cookies were pulled out of the oven and left to cool on top of the counter. As they waited for the cookies, Theo helped his dad wash the dishes, and once finished he asked, "Dad, I've been meaning to ask, but have you thought about expanding the shop?" Jacob glanced over to Theo as he asked, "What brought that up all of the sudden?" "Well, you and Uncle Ben always complain about certain tools that the shop doesn't have, or that would be nice to have. We just need more room, and we could get those tools, right?" Theo asked. Jacob shook his head lightly before he said, "Most of those tools are a lot of money. Plus, even if we had the space for the tools, we have no idea how to use most of them properly. We would either need to learn how to use them or hire someone who knows how to use them." "So? That doesn't sound that hard." Jacob rubbed Theo's head as he said, "It's a lot more complicated than that. Besides, we don't have the money for it." "I do," Theo said. Both Jacob and Daniel shared a glance before Jacob said, "That's your money, and you should save it for when you're older." "But I can always make more money. Plus, it's not like it would be a waste or anything. I would be helping out the family business," Theo said as he glanced between his parents. "True, but it would be better to invest it and save it for your future," Daniel said. "But what if I want to take over the shop when I'm older? I would be investing in my future that way, right?" Theo asked. Daniel shared a questioning glance with Jacob before she asked, "I thought you wanted to be a programmer?" "Programming isn't that hard, so why can't I do both? Besides, I like working on cars, it's fun." Jacob laughed as he picked up Theo and asked, "You like working on cars, Theo nodded his head as he said, "Yeah, it's fun and interesting. But I'll also create programs to help me work on cars too." Jacob had a 1,000-watt smile as he looked over towards Daniel, who let out a defeated sigh before she asked, "But I thought you liked programming?" "I do, but I think working on cars is more fun." Jacob placed Theo down as he asked, "What kind of programs would you create to help you work on cars?" "Well, Peter and I are already working on a project that should be able to help out with the shop." "Really? What is it?" Jacob asked in interest. Before Theo could respond, Millie interrupted as she said, "Can we eat the cookies now?" "Yeah, let's eat cookies," Isaac added. 00159. It's hard to spend money when you're young. About a month later, Peter and Theo completed the website and application for the shop. Theo wanted to show it off to everyone, so he asked his parents to invite everyone in the family over for a barbecue on the weekend. After everyone ate and were relaxing in the backyard, Theo brought out a tablet he asked his mom to buy for him. Even though Theo and his family were now rich, she didn't want to at first. His parents liked to keep most modern technology out of the house, so that was the main reason she refused. If it wasn't for the fact she was given a computer from work and asked to use it at home, they never would have gotten one in the first place. And if Theo hadn't shown interest in programming and even designed his first game, the family wouldn't have loosened the restrictions and bought him and Millie their own computers. At this point, the family still didn't have a TV in the house, and Daniel is the only one with a smartphone because Ezekiel gave her one for work. Daniel and Jacob both enjoyed the house without electronics because it made the family spend more time together. They even had family game night a few times a week. Actually, the only reason Daniel relented and bought Theo a tablet is because he explained he needed it to help with programming and testing applications. The tablet was basically bare besides the completed application for the shop he wanted to show off to everyone. Theo walked over to Jacob with the tablet and said, "Dad, this is the program Peter and I made for the shop." As Jacob took the tablet, Ben, Sarah, and John came closer to see it as well. Jacob pushed the icon to launch the application, and they were greeted by a slick loading screen that displayed some of the cars they built over the years. After it opened up, it asked for a username and password. Jacob showed the screen to Theo as he asked, "Why did it ask for this?" "This is the customer portal. It's so we can keep track of customers and their build specifications. It will also track a lot of other customer information in the future," Theo said with a smile. "But we already keep all that information in the office." Jacob said, "That's all in folders and binders you have to dig through. This will be digital, and all you have to do is push a button or two to find it. We also added a search function to make it even easier," Theo said with a proud smile. Ben and the others nodded in understanding as Jacob said, "All right, so it will make things easier on us when we have to do paperwork." "That's not even the main reason we made it," Peter excitedly said. "Dad, log in with the username test account and the password test 12345, Theo said as he smiled slightly. Jacob entered the information and a new screen popped up. It was the main menu for customers, and it listed a handful of options they could check out. Place build order, modify build order, check build progress, purchase history, payment center, and a few other icons filled the screen. Theo pointed to the modify build order button as he said, "Press that." After Jacob pressed the button, the screen changed to show a realistic 3D model of one of the cars in the shop. It just arrived a few days ago and was going to be stripped down next week before they checked the frame and cleaned up any rust. Jacob studied the model for a few moments before he said, "Not bad. It looks just like that Ford Galaxy in the shop." Theo smirked as he said, "That's because it is. We took a bunch of pictures with the application and it created this model. Now hit modify." For the next half an hour, Theo and Peter showed everyone the real power behind the application, and at the end of it, Jacob asked, "How did you even come up with this?" Theo shrugged as he said, "I just watched how you interacted with customers when you talked over a new build and then made a program that could do the same thing." "But this 3D model doesn't make sense. How did you make it do that?" Jacob asked as he pointed at the completed car build. Theo shrugged as he said, "We just thought of everything that it needed to do and created the functions for it. It wasn't that hard." Peter nodded in agreement before he added, "Yeah, that was probably the easiest part to make. All the options, parts, bodywork, lights, and other stuff was the hard part." Jacob glanced between the two boys for a moment before he asked, "So what else can this do?" Another half an hour passed as the boys proudly showed off all the features of the application for the customer before they showed the admin side. It let them keep track of the builds, take pictures, document the progress, create a parts list that could be ordered with a push of a button. It also included a lot of other helpful features like billing, inventory and consumables tracking, shop budget, payroll, and more. By the end, everyone was thoroughly impressed and praised the boys on their ingenuity. Before Jacob placed the tablet down, Theo said, "We also built a website that interacts with the application." "What?" Jacob asked in surprise. Theo had Jacob back out of the shop application and open a web browser before he typed in a website address. The website opened up to a simple page with a custom logo that read, "Welcome to PNM." Theo tapped on the logo and it opened up to the home page that only displayed three things. The first was a login button for customers. The second was a contact button that gave you an email address you could contact the shop through, and the last one read, "About Us." In the About Us area, it stated that P&M was a small, family-owned business that created unique custom cars made to order. There were no pictures of the cars they created, no pictures of the family or anything else. It was overall very simple and unassuming. After a quick tour of the site, Ben asked, "Why didn't you add any pictures of the cars we made?" Theo looked up at Ben as he said, "You guys don't like to show off or advertise, so we wanted to keep it simple. This is mostly designed for the current customers in mind anyways." Jacob nodded before he reached over to pat Theo and Peter on the head and said, "Great job, you two." Theo smiled at his dad before he said, "Everything is basically ready to go. We just need to collect customer contact information and emails before we send them links so they can create their accounts." "Sounds good to me." I will start going through our customer list on Monday and try to collect everyone's email for you. Ben said, we will also need to spend some time adding all the customer information stored in the office to the program so we have a digital copy of everything. Theo said after a moment. It took a few weeks to get emails for all their customers, but once everyone was signed up, it made everything easier. The shop bought tablets for everyone to use, and it took everyone a little while to get used to it. But within a month, everyone adapted to using the tablets and application for work. The feedback from the customers was also very positive, and they liked the fact they could get updated pictures of the build progress. There were a few issues with the whole process, though. The first one was an easy fix. Theo used magic to make all the tablets more durable. They would still break, but it took a lot more force than normal to do it. The other issue was from a couple customers who saw the application as a way to try and micromanage their car builds. The shop always had a few customers who would call weekly for updates or something like that. But with the application and updated photos of the builds, 2 customers decided they could call whenever new pictures were uploaded. It wouldn't have been an issue, but they would basically waste Jacob, Ben, Sarah, or John's time as they asked details about the photos and what was the next step in the process. Or they would complain about something they noticed in the photos and ask to have it fixed immediately, even though it was something that was already planned to be fixed at a later stage of the process. After a week of that happening, Jacob called the problem customers and basically told them, if you keep calling us over every photo we send you, we will stop the build where it is now, and you will have to find another shop to complete it. Theo wasn't completely sure how those whole conversations went, but both cars were still in the shop and being worked on. Theo also updated the application to help deter other customers from doing the same thing. In the build progress area just before you entered it each time, a disclaimer message popped up that read, please do not call the shop about any issues you might see in the progress photos. They are progress photos only, not photos of the completed project. If for some reason you want to change or modify the build, please do so in the Modify Build area. Do keep in mind that extra charges will occur if you do so late in the build. Thank you. With all of that out of the way, Theo again asked his dad about expanding the shop and buying more tools. It was winter break and Theo was helping his dad out in the shop when he asked, have you and Mom thought about my idea more? Jacob glanced up from the engine he was in the middle of disassembling as he asked, what idea? Expanding the shop and getting more tools. Theo said, oh, well, we still think you should invest that money and save it for when you're older. Theo gave his dad a flat look as he asked, do you know how much money I have? After helping buy John and Sarah their house and splitting the money with Peter and Millie, you should still have around $3 million currently in bonds, right? Jacob asked, that's only from the sale of the game when I still owned it. My 6% share in Vibe is worth a lot more. But you have to sell those shares to make any money. Jacob said. Theo shook his head before he said, no, I earn 6% of whatever the company makes each year in gross profit. So I will make millions this year just by owning part of the company. Jacob looked up as he asked, you really think you can earn that much? Theo nodded his head as he said, they sent out an email the other day that reported the estimated profits for the year. I showed it to Mom, and she said I would make at least $7 million after taxes this year. Jacob froze for a few moments before he asked, really? Yeah, that's why I want to help expand the shop and get more equipment. I will always have money as long as I hold onto the Vibe shares. Jacob started to work on the engine again as he said, I'll have to talk with your mom about it. Just after winter break and the start of the new year, Daniel agreed to let Theo spend some of his money to expand the shop and buy new equipment. She was still partly against the idea, but Theo begged her for 2 weeks straight before she finally relented to the idea. He was pretty sure Jacob begged her too, but he didn't like to snoop on them, so he wasn't completely sure. As for how they would expand the shop, Theo used his Ezekiel persona to help out. Since he bought up all the properties around the area already, he put up an empty plot of land next to his dad's business for sale and waited. Within a week, his parents contacted him about the land and asked to buy it. Theo used a third party to sell the land to them for a reasonable price, and from there they contacted an architect firm. Since the plan was to expand the shop, they needed to get plans drawn up and a lot of other things done. The estimated time before everything was completed was around the end of summer if everything went smoothly. As for the cost of the land, construction, tools, permits, and everything else, it wasn't cheap, But Jacob and Ben were able to get everything they wanted done, and Daniel wasn't too upset about it. 00160. A weird feeling. The sound of fists hitting flesh could be heard as two boys fought with each other. It wasn't a normal schoolyard fight, though, since both boys flickered around the training area faster than the eye could see. And both of them traded more blows with each other in a minute than professional fighters would during an entire fight. The high-speed fight was watched over by a handful of other kids who tracked the boys with practiced ease. The fight didn't seem to have a clear winner at first, but as it dragged on, it became clear one of the boys was losing steam. After another minute or so, the boy collapsed on the ground, completely exhausted. Theo stood over his defeated foe and let out a tired sigh before he asked, "Why can't you be like the others?" The other boy used the last bit of his strength to roll over as he said, "Because your skills are lacking. Besides, you only won because you have more chakra. And you fighting with me till you collapse helps me in what way exactly?" Theo asked. "The longer we fight, the faster you improve." Theo reached down and helped the other boy up as he said, "Don't use that as an excuse. You're just a battle maniac, Madara." "Pretty much. Even in a completely new world, you haven't changed one bit," Hashirama said. "It's just the power of youth. With our new bodies, it burns even brighter than normal." A boy in green spandex said. Theo glanced over to his new training partners and couldn't help but smile slightly. After the first group were given time to adjust to their bodies, Theo basically started a fight club with a handful of them. The group only had 9 members currently if he included himself, but would definitely grow in time. The only reason the group was currently so small was that the first group mostly contained non-combatants, plus the second and larger group were still adjusting to their new bodies. It would be another few weeks before they were ready for any type of combat-focused chakra training. Theo glanced at the boy in green spandex as he said, "You're up, guy. Yash, let's show everyone a brilliant display of youth," Guy said as he gave a thumbs up with his brilliant smile. A blonde-haired boy chuckled before he said, "This is the last spar. Then you need to practice Fusion. You also have magic practice after that," Tao said from her study area, where she was drinking tea and reading a book. Theo let out a tired sigh before moving out to the middle of the sparring area and squared off against Guy. They shared a nod before they disappeared and met each other with their fists. It took about half an hour before Guy ran out of chakra and was forced to stop. Unlike Madara, Guy at least stopped before he collapsed, but it was still close. Next, Theo started his Fuinjutsu lessons with Ashina Uzumaki, Minato, Tobarama, Mito, and Kushina. There were a few more Uzumaki seal masters Theo planned to study under, but they were part of the second group or haven't been given a body yet. As for his training, he was mostly forced to practice his penmanship with chakra infusion. He didn't need to practice his shoto or calligraphy though. It had more to do with precise chakra control that he focused on. As for the writing, characters, and patterns, they were more there to guide a new and inexperienced seal maker. Once someone became a seal master, they normally created their own Fuinjutsu scripts and perfected it. It was a lot like how sorcerers created their own magic system once they passed a certain skill level. Theo could already make the most basic explosive tags, but if he wanted to make anything else, he would first need to improve his chakra control and ink infusion to an appropriate level. Otherwise, any seal he attempted to make would either fail, break easily, or blow up while he made it. Fuinjutsu practice lasted for a couple of hours, and Theo used clones to help improve his learning efficiency. Once it was completed, the clones continued while Theo himself moved on to magic training with Tao and Agatha. Magic training was basically more sparring at this point, except Theo could only use magic to defend himself with, while Tao could use anything she wanted. If Theo wanted to move, attack, dodge, or anything else, he needed to use magic to make it happen. As for studying from books and learning more, Theo used clones for most of that, since it was mainly reading. Since only Theo could use magic, Tao forced him to practice every day and to put into use whatever his clones read about the day before. Once magic practice was completed, it was almost 3 in the morning. So after being healed up by Tsunade, Theo took a quick shower before he switched places with his clone and went asleep. Why take a shower and not just use a spell? There was just something about a nice hot shower after a long, tough workout. Besides going to school in the morning, helping out at the shop in the afternoon, then dinner and hanging out with his family. That was what Theo's daily routine turned into. He still visited Hela at least once a week and checked in with Tony too, along with his responsibilities in running the group he created. The months passed quickly and Theo's routine didn't change much. During that time, he focused mostly on training and giving more people bodies. He estimated it would be a couple years before everyone who wanted a body had one, because after the second batch, it took even longer than they thought for his soul to heal completely. So he took it slower and only created 100 bodies every couple weeks now. As for other projects he was working on, the cell phones and tablets he created with Tony had turned into a bigger success than he predicted. Most of it had to do with Vibe and how it was integrated into the device. The other factor was the network infrastructure they created. The fact people could easily stream high-quality videos on their phones helped out a lot. While other companies were now trying to rush their own cell phones to market, Tony had launched a bunch of smart home automation devices, all of which worked seamlessly with the phones and tablets he created. Since other companies were also in the process of trying to create phones, Theo decided to check on them. He mostly hacked into each company's servers to check their progress and designs. As for the few that kept their project files located offline, Theo just teleported into the company to look at them. He didn't care that much about the competition. He mostly wanted to see how far behind they were. While some of the phones were decent spec-wise, the software for all of them was terrible. He even tested out a few of the prototypes and could only shake his head in pity. With what they wanted to bring to market, Theo was sure most of the companies would give up after a year or two. A couple of them would definitely tough it out and try to take some of the market share. But unless something drastic happened, Tony's phones would always hold the lion's share of the mobile market. As for the phone project for the US government, it was still being worked on. The amount of paid government employees was ridiculous and Theo was positive half of their jobs didn't need to exist. So far, all of the higher-up positions in the government had phones. The main issue was everyone else. He focused on the federal government first, then state and local last. Once that was completed, he planned to branch out to government agencies, then law enforcement, first responders, and others. Tony fought back against the idea a bit, since the contracts weren't going to make much money. But he agreed to have Stark Industries bid for all the contracts they could, since Theo promised him more alien technology. As for expanding the phones into other countries and governments, that was a slow process. A few were already in talks, but a lot of them were on the fence since they were made by a US-based government contractor. While China, Russia, and a few other countries flat out refused even talking with Stark. Theo didn't mind though because no country banned the cell phones outright. Since that was the case, it couldn't stop him from sending phones as gifts to important people in power. So sooner or later, they would end up in the hands of most government officials of every country. It was a more roundabout way, but if it worked, Theo wouldn't complain. It was a Friday and something fell off to Theo. It started just after he woke up and he couldn't figure out why. Breakfast with his family, school, and then helping out at his dad's shop. All day he felt weird. It was as if someone or something was watching him. He used a couple spells when he was alone to figure out what was going on, but he found nothing abnormal. When he finally returned home with his family was when that weird feeling finally peaked. Something about his house was off, like someone had been inside the house while his family was out. Nothing looked out of place and Theo didn't see anything wrong, but he knew someone else had entered the house. Theo used a few spells on the house to make sure nothing was wrong and sent a quick text message to Tao and Agatha asking them to look into it themselves before he joined his family for dinner. At dinner, the feeling lingered, and for the first time since Theo put protection spells on his family, he regretted not doing something to the house itself. He considered it, of course, but his main concern at the time was making sure his family was okay if something happened. Well, and the fact that large-scale protection spells on a stationary object, like a house, could have unintended consequences. The main one is it lights up the whole place like a Christmas tree to people who can sense magic. Sure, if he had Tao build them, she could negate or fix most of the issues, like she did for the bases and Genosha. But when Theo brought up the idea, she refused because she wanted Theo to do it as a new form of training. Theo ended up giving up on the idea at the time, since he had a lot of other projects going on at the time that were more important. It would also take up most of his time to learn the skills properly since it involved rune magic engraving, magical item creation, and a few other skills Theo only touched on. In hindsight, Theo should have at least added a censor spell or two, or maybe even a clone to watch over the house. As he ate dinner with his family, he thought of different things he could implement going forward and wondered if Tao and Agatha found anything. He already planned to switch with a clone after dinner so he could talk with them, and also brainstorm a few ideas on how to safeguard his family's home going forward until his main projects to protect his family were completed. Once he finished dinner, Theo helped with the dishes before he went downstairs to his room and created a clone. As the clone headed upstairs, Theo moved to his closet and transported to his training room. When he appeared in the room, he turned towards Tao's area and froze. A man's voice rang out as he said, "Good to see you, Ezekiel. Or should I just call you Theodore? Or do you prefer Theo more?" Theo's eyes narrowed and his voice was raised as he asked, "How did you find me?"